Hi, today we are talking about preliminary business valuations and mediation. And quite frankly, this is a number that shapes the entire deal in your mediation. So, my name is Melissa Gregg, and I'm a financial mediator and business valuation expert with 20 plus years of experience in divorce and partner disputes. And we're going to kind of talk about mediation today as if you were going into divorce mediation, or maybe you're mediating a corporate dispute. So that's going to be where partners are kind of disagreeing, and maybe one is getting bought out and one is staying in the business. Typically, in all of these situations, you're going to need a business valuation. And most of the time, people go to look for a valuation. They start to call around and they see that this could cost $10,000, $25,000, or more. And what we want to encourage you to consider is a preliminary valuation, specifically in mediation, and working with a number that really shapes that deal and gets you in a good strategy. So in mediation, typically that first credible number that somebody presents is going to set the tone for the entire negotiation. So whether you're buying out a business partner or you're dividing assets in a divorce, that number doesn't have to be like a final certified valuation, a 100-page report that costs $25,000 or more. In fact, it's often what we call a preliminary valuation or a reality check valuation that anchors that discussion. It reveals like hidden leverage that maybe you didn't know you had, and it helps you negotiate with confidence. So today I'm going to walk through a bunch of different questions that answer about what preliminary valuations are, how to use them, how you can change the outcome of your mediation with it, and let's dive right in. So when we're looking at this, people obviously have a question about what is a preliminary valuation and how can I use it in mediation. So this is going to be kind of a condensed version of a full valuation. So a lot of times what we're talking about is running numbers. So a preliminary valuation is like an early estimate of the business or the asset's value. So it's prepared before you do like a full appraisal. And in mediation, we kind of use it to start getting the discussions going, to set a realistic expectation of what the value is, and then to also identify if there are gaps in the information. So it's not the final word, but it's a strategic tool to guide the negotiation. And the point is to get one in the early stages so that you can start having some of those settlement negotiations. And quite frankly, a business valuation could take 4 to 6 weeks, or some people it takes 4 to 6 months. So do you really want to wait around all that time just to wait for a trial or some other litigation issue? Or do you want to try to take matters into your own hands and try to negotiate a deal? So a preliminary valuation is different than a formal valuation. It's faster, it's less expensive, and it's based on the best data that you have available. So it means that sometimes you don't have all the information, but you need to make some reasonable assumptions. So a formal valuation is more comprehensive. It's fully documented. It's court ready. We've done everything that we need to be deposition ready, right? So these preliminary numbers are typically for strategy. There's not usually a formal report, and they're not really legally final, okay? So why do mediators use preliminary valuations instead of waiting for a final number? Because waiting for a final number can take forever, and it can stall the progress that you have in the mediation. And quite frankly, some people are not even able to go to mediation unless you have a value on the business. So if you don't have a value on the business and you have every other number, you're stuck. So this is going to give you a little bit of an opportunity to present a number. Like, what if right now you only have, data that's 2 years old? You can make some assumptions. You can look at those values, and then for something like that, it's like a great strategy tool because you're going to have to update it. But you have to be mindful that you need to know how to utilize that valuation in a mediation context, and it's very strategic. So hopefully we'll get to some of those questions as well. So can this preliminary valuation be used in business and divorce mediation? Absolutely. In business mediation, you're actually looking to buy out a partner. And so you can buy them out, or you're looking at some sort of dispute resolution. So you're either have a contract disagreement or a vendor disagreement. But at each point, maybe you even have like a post-transaction issue, which means you bought a company, you sold a company, things didn't quite go well, and now you need to revisit it because you feel like you were damaged. So in a divorce, sometimes if there is a primary business that is held by both parties or even one party, the court is going to force you to have a valuation on that business, or you're going to need to sell it. And for the most part, it is like the family's financial kind of sometimes their only way of getting money and providing for the family. So it's not going to be reasonable to just go sell it to figure out what it's worth. You can actually hire somebody to do a preliminary valuation. So who should you hire to do something like this? Well, first of all, I don't know if a lot of people do this. We started doing it a long time ago for mediation purposes. And so ideally, you're going to hire like a qualified financial mediator, business valuation expert, or even potentially a forensic accountant. And so you need to have somebody that understands not only the numbers, how to do a valuation or a business valuation. And there could be other things as well. Like you might need an asset appraiser. You might need an appraisal of the house, but they have to understand negotiation context and make sure that this valuation is credible, even if it's a preliminary viewpoint. So what's the best time to get this preliminary valuation? Is it during mediation? No. It is as soon as possible, as early as possible, and ideally before you even make an offer, which means you're making an offer before mediation starts. And so the process is, if you've identified that you have a business, you identified that you're in some sort of legal situation, if a divorce or a partner dispute, mediation is going to be one of your options. And so don't wait around to get the business valuation because you know that the business owner is going to get it or the other side's going to get it, because nobody wants to spend $25,000 to get a business valuation. So a preliminary business valuation might only cost you $5,000, maybe even less depending upon who you work with. But the sooner you get it, the faster you can make an offer, you can get a mediator, and you can start talking and negotiations, right? Because the reality is whatever your value is and whatever the other side's value is, create the bookends, right? One of you is going to be high, one of you is going to be low, or vice versa, the other way around. And either way, they create sort of the area with between these two numbers is where you're going to negotiate. So do you really need two really big valuations to start to negotiate? No, you need the number. You need a range of reasonable value so that when you go in to negotiate, you know what those bookends are. Okay. So, what happens if you wait too long to get a valuation? You're going in blind, or you're just postponing the inevitable and it's taking months and months for you to get some movement, which means lawyers are being paid, financial advisors are being paid, the mediators getting paid, everybody's just waiting around. So if you really want to have some control over the negotiations and you don't want to risk negotiating blind, or relying upon the other side's numbers, or being pressured into a quick decision without knowing the actual true range of value, go ahead. But typically, if you're working with somebody on a preliminary valuation, then they're crunching numbers. A lot of times when we're presenting these values to the people, I'm showing them what the high is, what the low is, what the reasonable range, what the other side could think about the value. This is strategic. This is strategy. This is not about putting numbers in a piece of paper and then hoping that they miraculously negotiate for you. This is understanding what the true reality about the business is and where do you have leverage to negotiate. Okay, so should you share that preliminary valuation with the other side right away? No, no. And a lot of times you're not even putting anything in writing. You're just talking it through, and then you're putting a number on your settlement offer, right? So even to put forth a settlement offer, you need a number. So if you don't have that range of value, you don't have a reasonable number, and you don't really want to negotiate and provide an offer for that number, if you don't have some backup that they say, oh, okay, well, we might consider your offer, but we'd like to see it. We'd like to see that it was done by a reputable valuation firm or a valuation expert. And so those types of things doesn't mean that you're going to offer to share with them. It means that you are going to set the anchor in the deal. Okay. Other times you may have to exchange those values. Well, at the point that you're exchanging them, you might be exchanging valuation summaries or schedules, depending upon what type of litigation you're involved in. Can you use this preliminary valuation to anchor the negotiations? Absolutely. If the other side is taking too long, if the other side doesn't want to spend the money and they haven't found a low-cost provider for a preliminary valuation, which again, I don't know if there's a ton of people out there doing it. I know we're doing it, so I'm assuming that there's some others. But this could really kind of, when you create a credible, well-supported number early, this first reasonable figure is where everybody is starting from, okay? And then even later, they're either going to move you off this position. So if you're coming in with a value and they're not, that is leverage. That is strategy so that you're more prepared and they're just talking about what they think the value is, or the business owner is saying, well, I think it's actually this. The mediator is going to look at them and say, well, but have you proved it? Do you have a third party that also says that that's the value? Okay. So when you're doing a business valuation or you get a preliminary valuation, how does it help identify missing financial information? Well, first of all, we're going to ask for a variety of financial data. So we actually usually put together a document request list, or it's going to be things that are being asked for in formal discovery in your case. But it also shows where we need to make assumptions. And so there could be documents, statements, or records that are still needed. We might actually need some of the bank statements, right? So if somebody has reported information on their tax return and it doesn't seem quite right, we might need to get the bank statements to verify some of the information. We might want to look a little bit deeper in the general ledger and understand what are these expenses and are they business related or maybe personal and a little discretionary. So what documents should you gather before you get a preliminary valuation? Financial statements, tax returns, bank loan documents, bank applications for loans, the actual loan documents, partnership agreements, you can request if there's any other valuations or appraisals, maybe they've appraised the building and things like that. So if you need a more complete list, go ahead and reach out to us and we can provide one. Can you still get a preliminary valuation if you don't have all the financial records? And this is more important in divorce, but it could also be important with a partner dispute. Absolutely. You can get a preliminary look at the valuation, and this is going to be an ideal time to get it because we need to make some reasonable assumptions. We need to look at what information is missing. You need to then request some of that information in mediation if they have been a little toxic and avoiding some of the discovery. So how should you respond if the other side refuses to share the financial data? You need to use the gap to your advantage, which means when you're presenting the preliminary value, it's based on the available data. It's based on maybe older data. And you then go into mediation and ask, how can we resolve this without full information? So this is going to put pressure on the other side during mediation to either give you the documents, to either request it like right when you're in there, to say, hey, accountant, send me those files, and then they can give you the link immediately. But it's also going to put a little bit of pressure on them in the fact that they're being exposed, that they're not freely giving documentation. A lot of times a judge is going to say, hey, you guys should give that information, but there's no police. There's nobody that's coming and knocking on their door and like confiscating their records, right? So you really have to just have some sort of public kind of shaming in the mediation to try to get that data, and then say you will update your preliminary number with the new data. So it's almost like you can kind of consider this as like a draft valuation, but I think preliminary valuation is a little bit better. And it gives you some capability to kind of negotiate with that number. Okay. So what are some of the issues you might uncover during a preliminary valuation? You might uncover unreported income, which means that there was cash that they never talked about or produced. There's inconsistent expenses. There's sudden drops in revenue, missing documentation. All of these could point to some deeper financial issues that you may want to request additional documentation. So how do you use a preliminary valuation to challenge unrealistic offers? Well, if the other side has already done a valuation, or maybe you work together to do a joint valuation, but the numbers just don't seem right. Okay. Like recently we had a client that had like $1 million in the bank, and the valuation came back at 500,000. Odds are that's probably not going to be the right number. And so you can calmly ask your how questions, like, how did you arrive at that number? And then compare it to what you have as a valuation. It may uncover, like a lot of times, these valuations, maybe that the other side got, could have had the wrong data. There could be mathematical errors. So you want to make sure that you kind of are checking the numbers, and you have somebody else that's run numbers so that you can compare them. And this kind of shifts the burden back to them to justify their number if you can talk the talk and you have some reasonable things to discuss based on you've already strategically hired somebody to give you some of that information up front. Okay, so maybe I keep on talking about these how questions, but the how questions work best when the other party disputes your valuation. So if they say you're wrong, then you can come in and be like, well, how did you calculate that? How would you work in this practice? What would be your reasonable salary? How would a court see that it's fair that you keep everything and I get nothing? This is going to keep these conversations more solution focused and less kind of tense, if you will. So how do you see a different solution? How do you propose that we solve this matter? How do you propose that we settle this matter? Okay. So how can you build multiple settlement scenarios from one preliminary valuation? This is going to be key. A lot of times, if you're working with somebody in this context, and we really look at ourselves as like financial strategists, right? So if you're modeling these what if situations, like what if we sold it? What if there was a buyout? What if we continued to own it? What if we sold a portion of it? You can see how each of those options impact both sides. So this is going to be that if you're modeling different scenarios where, well, maybe we take all the cash out, or maybe we will stay together in the business, which most judges do not like, but maybe we'll continue to own this business because we need the insurance and we can get along. Those are types of things that you're going to have to settle outside of the court. The court is typically not going to tell you to stay connected if you don't get along. So getting kind of multiple scenarios with your valuation firm is going to help you be flexible to know where you can go given certain circumstances. Okay, is there a risk of overvaluing or undervaluing in your preliminary number? Yes, there could be, but for the most part, overvaluing something could stall kind of the negotiation because you guys are so far apart. But undervaluing something means that it could cost you actual dollars. And so when you're working with somebody for a preliminary valuation, you almost want to look at what's your best and worst case, but where would it be reasonable? The reasonable range is where you want to stay. But that expert should be able to tell you if you did everything in your favor, what would be the highest value? If you did everything in their favor, what would be the lowest value? And then you want to stay within the reasonable range value. Okay. So let's see. How is a preliminary business valuation used in partner disputes? So this is going to be great because a lot of times we're being hired by the company, which means our goal is to produce a value that is in that reasonable range, right? But to also show them, hey, this is what the high side would be, this is what the low side would be, and here's the reasonable range. So it gives all the partners kind of a shared reference point for buyouts or restructuring. It also reduces some arguments about what it's worth, and it helps with resolution. So a lot of times we recommend people that are business owners or multiple partners to get business valuations every year. And that means that each year you're going to kind of establish what the value is. You're going to have people that could buy in or out at that value. And then what would that look like if they actually decided to exit? And so that's going to eliminate some of the litigation possibilities, but also you're kind of determining some mediation up front. Okay. What role does it play in buying out a business partner? Well, it's going to establish kind of an initial price range. And a lot of times that preliminary number needs to be communicated to them. And so this means find somebody that's going to be able to discuss it, to be able to present it, to be able to make sense of it to the other side, and also that it's reasonable and rational. Because if you come in and say, you know, this diamond is worth $1 and you wreck the credibility up front, you're probably not going to be in a good situation that people are going to trust that valuation person. Okay. Can a preliminary valuation help save a business deal from collapsing? Yeah, a lot of times when somebody is going to sell their company, getting a preliminary valuation could help you establish the price, right? You don't need a full-blown report. You just need enough information to know how to move forward, to know what your reasonable range is, and to know what a premium range would be, right? And so this kind of number could help you kind of keep those negotiations alive while you're working out some of those final details. But the reality is sometimes we use them to say, hey, if nobody really knows what to offer on this company, here's a reasonable value. Make sure that you're above it. Okay. Why is a preliminary valuation essential for marital businesses and divorce? This is also going to be a place where you could get a joint valuator, which means that they're going to present the value to the couple at the same time. And so this helps that both spouses know what the numbers are. They can negotiate from the same baseline. They might even ask the person to say, okay, well, what would be a one number value? And so it allows less manipulation in the numbers as well. What if one spouse claims that the business is separate property? You're going to need to get evidence, and they're going to need to prove up the separateness of that property in court. And so a preliminary valuation can still establish what the value is. So even if it's a separate asset, typically we have to put a number on it and we have to put it on the financial disclosures. And so it at least gives you some idea of what that value is, even if it's going to move off of the balance sheet because it's a separate asset. How can a preliminary valuation reveal hidden income or perquisites in a family business? So a lot of times we're going to be analyzing financial patterns, distributions, owner draws, benefits that may not be showing up on salary records. It's also going to disclose discretionary items. Like we almost know exactly where to look at for discretionary items: meals and entertainment, auto expenses, like sort of random supplies, things like that, travel, training. All of these areas are where we put these discretionary items, which means that they're just not necessary for the business, but the business owner has chosen to utilize funds for that. It means that we probably are going to add some of those back and make some assumptions. So a preliminary valuation can actually make some assumptions. We don't need to go look at every single thing to figure out hidden income. We could make an assumption that the person has utilized $10,000 a month on their outside relationship, and we're going to add that back. Okay. So there, you gives a lot more flexibility to make some assumptions and how they would affect value if you did then figure out that that was true. Okay. Is a preliminary valuation admissible in court? Typically not. This is going to be like a negotiation tool, not a full-blown report, not totally reviewed, and really it's for settlement purposes only. Now, the basis of it though is like financial analysis and putting your data. At any point, if you have all of the data, you could take it forth and then finalize it in a more robust report or a summary that is prepared for depositions. But the initial one at the lower cost is typically going to be for negotiation strategy and settlement opportunities. So when should you move from a preliminary valuation to a certified valuation? When you're getting close to an agreement. If you're facing a court deadline, or if you have agreed to exchange reports with the other expert. Okay, so typically that's going to happen when you're dealing with highly contested assets in a divorce, or you have a partner dispute where one partner needs to buy out the other. So again, if you need something more formal at some point in the litigation process, you would move from a preliminary valuation to the actual valuation. And then once that's finalized and put out in writing, it could be discoverable. And also that would be the document that we would exchange with the other side and then get ready for a deposition to defend that value. Okay. Can you use a competing value or can you use a preliminary valuation strategically? Yes. You can compare your preliminary valuation to the other side's valuation. It will start to expose what assumptions you agree upon and what assumptions you do not agree upon. And so a lot of times if the expert is in the room with you, maybe with your lawyer in the mediation, this is going to be when you have them sort of negotiating for you and trying to understand what did the other side do, where are we aligned, and where are we just completely apart. Okay. What's the biggest mistake people make when they're relying upon a preliminary valuation in mediation is acting as if it is the end all be all final valuation. This is a starting point. This is a place that you use it to guide the deal, but not to lock yourself into one number. So you have a couple different ideas of what the value would be, and you have some ways that you can move into that space and negotiate. A lot of times we, again, need to figure out what are those two endpoints, right? You're over here, they're over here, but you're not negotiating from every number from 0 to 500 million. You might be negotiating between like 2 million and 3 million. That allows you to negotiate somewhere in between, and you don't need a valuation to tell you the exact number to stick with in the negotiations. It's typically just one piece of the puzzle. There could be other things like your salary or other issues in the divorce or partner dispute that you have to take into account. And so what you're doing is just trying to narrow the negotiations. And you have to understand, do you really want to spend $25,000 on a piece of paper that you're still going to negotiate between? No, probably not. So think of this as one way to get enough information for you to go in and negotiate your position. But business valuations are very complex. And so working with somebody that's going to give you a preliminary idea of the valuation is going to save you time, effort, and money. If you do some of these things and you need some additional assistance, feel free to book a 90-minute strategy session with us to see if a preliminary valuation would be something that would be useful in your situation. Again, my name is Melissa Gregg, and you can reach out to us at valuationmediation.com.